Okay, here we go. If you are one of those people who has been following, who has an interest in this constantly evolving story of sporting bodies and pressure groups and individuals debating and thrashing out this business of trans people, particularly trans women in sport, and how they fit within the present sporting zeitgeist, then this video is for you. I think you're going to find this interesting. I think you're going to find this fascinating, because the UK Sport Council, a sort of umbrella body for the sort of individual sports body, Sport Scotland, Sport Wales, Sport Northern Ireland, Sport England and UK Sport, has commissioned and published a report giving guidance for transgender inclusion into domestic sport within the UK, but I think this could have ramifications far wider than the United Kingdom. What I intend to do in this video is to discuss that. There's quite a lot to discuss, so what I first want to do is to give you a sort of TLDR version. That might just wet your sort of lips for what's going to come, or it might be enough for you. But I'm going to give you that first so you have some idea. So they've commissioned this report. The report was in several parts. They commissioned, I suppose, 3 parts. They had a consultation with over 300 people and 170 organisations, and they interviewed these people, and they've got that part of it. They looked at sporting policies that were germane to the subject of trans people in sport from around the world and of different sports. And then they looked at the science, and they published those as different documents, and then they've given their findings and conclusions. And I think that Sports Council here has been pretty brave, actually. And I find this a step forwards. I'll explain more of that later. But really, this is not... The reason it's so brave is not because they've said this is the model that must be followed, this is the way forwards. They're giving that ability to each individual sport to do that. But where they have been brave is that finally somebody has stepped up to the plate and admitted that we need to get away from these mealy-mouthed, appease everybody statements that we maximally value inclusion and fairness and everything, and that we're going to come up with some kind of solution that's going to solve all these different things. They have nailed their flags to the mast, folks, and said that is not possible, that these are mutually exclusive outcomes, and that if you prioritise one, it will be at the expense of the other. And I propose to you that this is quite a brave stance and quite a step forward in terms of these things. The backdrop of this are sporting organisations around the world that just make these mealy-mouthed statements about how they're going to manage to achieve fairness and inclusion at the same time, and everybody's going to be happy and it'll all be sorted. As you will see, as I will read out for you, a lot of the people who run these sporting bodies, the professionals at the highest level, when they were interviewed anonymously and they could speak off the record for these reports, they gave their personal reservations and their fears that these are not compatible goals, that one is not achievable alongside the other. You have to pick between one or the other. And then we have the general animosity of the entire space. Let me read out for you a passage from one of the reports that the Sports Council had made, which will give you an idea of just what has been going on here. The level of frustration, animosity and emotionality was high in the many of interviews. There was a lot of swearing, shouting, crying and anxiety displayed during interviews. A significant number of interviewees said that they would only be involved if anonymity was assured because people were afraid to say in public what they privately believed. The overwhelming majority of people who considered fairness and safety could not be achieved with transgender inclusion into female sport did not feel confident to voice these opinions. Some said they had been threatened with sanction or disciplinary action if they spoke out. Many of the interviewees who held positions with sporting agencies said their personal opinions were in direct conflict with that of their employer or agency's stated position. Many felt they had no option but to remain silent in order to keep their job. There was a frequently voiced frustration which regularly reduced the interviewees to tears or hostility. Some interviewees considered the perception of transgender inclusion in society had deteriorated as a result of policies forcing inclusion before the implications were thought through. What a mess we've created for ourselves with this. What a coercive environment, a toxic environment environment for these debates to take place, where quite clearly a large number of people hold opinions privately but are being forced into expressing different opinions publicly, or just not saying anything, or formulating policies on behalf of the sporting bodies that they are responsible for that they do not believe in and do not believe are even possible. That is the kind of mess we've got ourselves in, and I think the Sports Council might be actually showing enough backbone to get us out of it. An organisation that hasn't shown us much backbone, in fact, is probably running slugs a close second in the least backbone of the year competition, would be the International Olympic Committee. Bear in mind the IOC represents the Olympics, right? The very pinnacle, the very elite of elite sport. Not what takes place at your local leisure centre, but the elite of an international sport. And the IOC's original position has always been that fairness is critical within sporting categories. In 2015, they wrote, "The overriding sporting objective is and remains the guarantee of fair competition." Now, the IOC said that at a time where they thought that reducing testosterone would do everything that it would need to do in terms of reducing the performance of trans women to the equivalent of biological females, cis women, if you will. Now that it looks like that is not the case, what the IOC is doing, seemingly out of fear as much as anything else, I can think of no other reason to account for this, is that they've now changed their position to this. Richard Budgett of the IOC recently. The particular changes from 2015 are the emphasis on the priority of inclusion and on the avoidance of harm, but always bearing in mind the importance of fair and meaningful competition. You can see what I mean about mealy-mouthed statements, but you can see also that the IOC was very tough and firm that fairness was a priority. Of course it is. This is the elite level sport, the highest level sport. Whilst they thought that they could achieve it whilst not angering certain groups within society, then they were very staunch that this was very important. Now they're not so sure that they can do it. They're backtracking now. They're abandoning their principles now, and I find that quite tragic. Okay, so in brief, what the Sport Council is saying is that they've looked at the science, they've looked at it all, and it does not look as if there is a way that you can take someone who has gone through a male puberty that has been exposed to testosterone for a large number of years, that there is anything that you can do to them which will mitigate all the advantages they have accrued as a result of that. That even if you reduce their testosterone down to zero now, that although it will mitigate some of those advantages and bring them closer towards the biological female equivalent, it won't go the whole way. And so what they're saying is, you as a sporting body will have to decide which you are going to prioritise. Do you want to prioritise inclusion, or do you want to prioritise fairness? But you cannot do both, or at least you cannot do both at the same time. You might want a different model for the elite level of your sport and the local grassroots level, but you're going to have a model, and you're going to have to nail your flag to the mast and saying we're prioritising this one over this one, or this one over this one. I think that is a large step forwards. What I want to do in the rest of the video now is to get a little bit more into the meat of this. What they do in their report is two things. They give a bulleted sort of a list of principles. I want to go through most of those principles, give you a little bit more of the background, take the principles from the guidelines and then go into the other documents and explain a little bit more about them. And then once I've done that, I want to give you their solution, their little algorithm that they do, and say some bits about that. I really, really like it, not least because the model that I've been banging on about since March 2019, when I made this video up here, of the female only and open category, is a model that they are now advocating. So I'm really, really happy about that. That's finally looks like it's getting some traction. Okay, so let's get on with that, and I'll give you the first one of these principles. But before I do, and I'm doing this because this I think is really important to the first principle that I'm about to read out, and a criticism, a minor criticism, but a criticism that I have of it, I want to read you out the definitions that they have given. It's good that they've defined the terms inclusion, fairness and safety, but it's important that we understand what definitions they've used, because it's not necessarily the definitions that we would understand. And I'm going to read these definitions out in reverse order. Safety, which is also referenced in the Equality Act, refers to safety from the risk of injury. Okay. Fairness means competitive equity in relation to the sex category and is defined within the Equality Act in relation to strength, stamina and physique in gender-affected sport. I have a little bit more to say about the idea of fairness and meaningfulness. I won't do it in this video. I'll do another little video for patrons. Don't worry, it'll be an unpledged video, but a video that will run alongside this and will be released at the same time. So if you're interested in that, you can have a watch of that. This is the interesting one for now. For the purpose of this work, we are using inclusion to mean the inclusion of transgender people into the category of their choice. So to call a spade here, what we're talking about with inclusion, because we're mainly talking about trans women here, that's where the issues tend to crop up, because that's where the physiological performance issues crop up. What we're talking about is a trans woman effectively being able to say, I want the labels of the sporting categories to be man and woman, not male and female or open and female. I want them to be man and woman, and I wish to compete in the category that's labelled woman. And anything beyond or below that would not, in these circumstances, class as inclusion. That's my understanding of it, because this would be an issue of affirmation. And so to label the categories in a different way or to put a trans woman in a different category might be regarded as insulting, but certainly would be regarded as not affirmatory, and that would be the issue. So the reason that I'm pointing that out to you is twofold. One, to say that effectively failing in inclusion paradoxically doesn't mean exclusion. Inclusion here just means in terms of the category of your choice, not that you haven't got a category. But then let me read you this first principle and you'll see the issue here. All of the sports councils are committed to the inclusion of transgender people in sport and physical activity. Now, I can tell you, because I've read through the documentation and the bits where it's talking about the interviews and what everybody had to say, that unless they're making all that up, that seems to be true. Almost to a person, everybody was really, really committed and concerned about including trans people in sport, and the report talks about how important it is to people's health, how trans people are a group that tend not to take part in sport because there are a number of significant social hurdles to doing so. They often don't feel welcome, and most of these sporting organisations and bodies, in fact all of them, and individuals were committed to trying to overcome those hurdles. That is what they're talking about when they're talking about inclusion there. Right? They're not talking about allowing people to identify into the category of their choice. So while that's a wonderful thing that everybody's pro-inclusion, the problem is that actually immediately they're using a definition of the term inclusion which is not really in line. It's not really in line with the definition that they've given. It's perhaps more in line with the definition that most of us would have had for the term inclusion. Okay, that's it for the first principle. Categorisation within the sex binary is and remains the most useful and functional division relative to sporting performance. Several times the report outlines that other categorisations are useful, such as age, disability, weight, etc. But it says that sex binary is the primary one. And let me read for you a couple of paragraphs that give you an example of just how much difference there is between typical and elite male performance and female performance. Have a listen to this. Adult male athletes have on average a 10 to 12% performance advantage over female competitors in swimming and running events, around 20% advantage in jumping events, 35% greater performance in strength-based sports for similar sized athletes. When the average size males are compared with average size females, the difference is such that the males are half as strong again as females. According to data from the NHS, 50% of males are taller than more than 95% of females. With longer, straighter limbs and bigger hands and feet, males have greater muscle mass concentrated in the upper body, bigger hearts and lungs and greater stamina through higher hemoglobin, oxygen carrying capacity, than females. The difference in performance, even at the lower range of 10 to 12%, is not small in terms of competitive outcomes, and would result in Adam Peaty being beaten by half the pool length in a short course 100 metres breaststroke competition, Dina Asher-Smith by more than 20 metres in the 200 metres track sprint, and Samo Farah being lapped twice in the 10,000 metres track race. The reality that males and females do not often play competitive sport against each other makes it difficult to appreciate the difference in physical capacity in most cases, particularly in team sports. However, an understanding of the gap between the two sexes can be recognised by results of practice matches between national senior women's football teams against underage boys teams in recent years. The national teams from Australia, USA and Brazil were beaten comprehensively 7-0, 5-2 and 6-0 respectively by club teams of 14 and 15-year-old boys. Current scientific evidence indicates that the difference between the strength, stamina and physique between the sexes is largely due to the higher testosterone levels of males during their lifetime. While this is not universally accepted, it is the basis for limitation of testosterone levels as required by the IOC for those transgender women who wish to compete at the Olympics. So I think this is absolutely bang on. Clearly, you can see what was written there. The sex binary is important because there is such a huge difference. Without having that categorisation, effectively a protected category for female athletes, female athletes will never, ever, ever get the opportunity to compete at the elite level. There will be as many female athletes at the elite level as there are octogenarians. Literally, that is how many will be there. Now, I know that people sometimes propose alternative categories, right? The problem is with these alternative categories is that really we're not looking to give opportunities to people whose muscle mass is below a certain number of kilograms or testosterone levels below a certain number of nanomoles or what have you. What we're looking to do is to give opportunities to biological females. That's the whole point of doing it. And so all these different categories, the way that they will be assessed as success or failures will be in terms of how many that are competing at the top level in these categories are female. That's what will tick the box success or failure. If that's what you're looking to do, if that's how you're going to measure success or failure by how many elite females are involved, why not just go straight to the well and have a category of elite females? Because every other example that I've heard of fails, because effectively what you end up with is two categories, one that is dominated by elite males, the very, very physiological best human beings on the planet for that discipline, and then another category which you fudge together to try and create a category which will allow females to compete at the top level, and that category will be dominated by 20 or 30 elite females versus tens of thousands of males who all have the same physiological characteristic, and then those elite females are just swamped by sheer weight of numbers, ergo you end up with another category which will be dominated by males, just simply in this case through sheer weight of number. So these things tend to fall flat on their face. This is why the sex binary is so important within sport, and why, if it was so easy to create an alternative that did the same thing, don't you think we would be doing it? But the fact is, the people who propose these things can never give an example of how it works. All they do is wave it away and say, well, I'm just giving you an example. It's for the experts to come up with the details and come up with something that actually works. The experts don't do that because the experts can't, because frankly, if what you want is a category for females, pretty much the only way you can do it is to have a category for females. Okay, on to the third principle. Principle 3. Evidence indicates it is fair and safe for transgender people to be included within the male category in most sports. This recognises what I think most of us understand, or at least need to get our heads around, which is that this categorisation of sport is not asymmetric. It is the same as the boundary between the age open that we have in almost every sport around and categories like masters categories, over 40s, over 50s, etc., etc. They are not symmetrical boundaries. That age boundary is not to protect the 30-year-old athlete from the excellent 45-year-old athlete. Is to protect the 45-year-old from the person who is in their sporting peak. Likewise, it is to protect female athletes from the advantages, the sporting advantages of male athletes, and not the other way round. And this is why it's not because of sexism and misogyny that it's always about trans women in sport, not trans men. It's because the same issues simply do not crop up when it comes to trans men competing in male sport, because they don't bring with them those physiological advantages. If anything, they're bringing with them physiological disadvantages that they are hoping to mitigate by taking exogenous testosterones as part of their cross-sex hormone therapy. They give reference to safety, and again I ought to say something about that, because fundamentally and philosophically there is again a big asymmetrical difference here. I tend to think that World Rugby got this right. What World Rugby said is, if you're a trans man and you want to compete in male rugby, that's fine, but what we'll do is we'll get you to sign a disclaimer just to say that you understand the risks. Here's the danger here. Trans men don't take these physiological advantages with them. They maybe take physiological disadvantages that may not be fully mitigated by their cross-sex hormone therapy, and that might place somebody in some danger. But the person that it will be placing in danger will be them. They're adults, they can decide. If anybody's taking a risk by them transitioning and taking part in the category that aligns most with their new identity, the risk is on them. They are the one taking the risk. That is why this is fundamentally different to a biological male transitioning, competing as a trans woman in a female category, in a combat sport, in a collision sport, because here it is not them that's in danger, it's the other people that they are competing against that are in danger. That is a fundamental difference, and this is why, both in terms of fairness and in terms of safety, these are so much less of an issue when it comes to trans men. Because if anybody is going to lose out, it's the one and not the everybody else, right? And usually in sport, that's the principle. If you do something to yourself that puts you at a disadvantage, nobody's too bothered about it. But if you do something that puts everybody else at a disadvantage, then we start paying attention and saying, well, is that a legitimate thing that you've done within the categorisation boundaries, or is it an illegitimate thing that you have done? Okay, on to point 4. Principle 4. Competitive fairness cannot be reconciled with self-identification into the female category in gender-affected sport. So let me read you a couple of bits from the report that chimes with that and give you a couple of comments on it. So this is the first bit. Over 90 individuals interviewed had 20 or more years experience in sport and could be described as the sports professionals who had a full-time or near full-time involvement in sport. While they had a shared appreciation and empathy for transgender people and agreed everyone had a right to participate in sport, most considered that it is unfair and unmanageable for transgender women to participate in competitive female sport with or without requirement. This view was held by a majority of interviewees from sport, and this included some transgender women. No interviewees came forward with meaningful suggestions or solutions as to how the situation could be resolved. There were many suggestions for transgender-only sport or combined sport, but it was specifically the category of female sport for which a solution was not proffered. So I think this chimes in with what I was saying before, which is that it's okay to make these suggestions and then say, oh, well, but I'm not an expert on sport. The professionals, the experts can work it out. The problem is the experts can't work it out. They can't find a way of formulating these new categories which will provide sport for females, but which won't be labelled a female category or do any of these things, right? So they're a non-starter. They are dead in the water, effectively. And then there was this, two groups with different value systems. Really interesting, this, in terms of framing the entire debate in terms of self-identification and inclusion. There was a fundamental division between two distinct groups of respondents. One group believed in the value of inclusion. It was evident to them that sport was a vehicle for social imperatives and sport was subservient to these outcomes. The other distinct group believed in the integrity of sport itself. To these respondents, fair and safe competition and adherence to rules gave sport validity and was the most basic requirement which underpins the position and role which sport occupies within society. The contention and the estimation of unfairness related almost entirely to the category of female participation. It was in this category that competitive advantage was deemed either irrelevant or unproven, or alternatively of paramount importance and incontestable. That shows you the gulf in this conversation, really. The groups seemed mutually exclusive, and this can be considered a values-based dichotomy. The requirement of these two groups cannot be reconciled within the existing structure of sport. While the vast majority of people with a lived experience in sport adhered to the philosophy of the integrity of sport, this was not universal. In particular, some, mostly female sports people, believed overwhelmingly in inclusion and did not consider unfairness relevant or justifiable on current understanding. And perhaps more surprisingly, some transgender people were the most vociferous about what they considered the unfairness of inclusion of transgender people in female sport. Okay, it's a mess, I think, is what you get from that. It is a mess. But as you can see, that fits in with their principle 4, that fairness cannot be reconciled with self-identification. And neither of these groups seem to be able to do it, and neither of these groups seem to feel that you even need to do it. They both stand by the position that their principle is the most important, and that sport should be sort of defined in terms of either it's all about inclusion and that is paramount, or it's about fairness and fairness is paramount. Principle 5. Based upon current evidence, testosterone suppression is unlikely to guarantee fairness between transgender women and natal females in gender-affected sports. I'll read out what else it says here. Transgender women are on average likely to retain physical advantage in terms of physique, stamina and strength. Such physical differences will also impact safety parameters in sports which are combat, collision or contact in nature. Recent international policy on testosterone limits are set at a level below 5 nanomoles in sports which choose to provide entry into female sports for transgender women. This is more appropriate than the 10 nanomoles which is stipulated by the International Olympic Committee and which remains within the normal range for males. The current preliminary 12-month period is unlikely to result in an achievable minimization of physical capacity. So this is actually something, I was one of those that hoped that as more research came out, it would show that this testosterone suppression would, for quite a lot of sports, do the trick. It would fully mitigate the advantages of male physiology. As more information comes out, it's looking that is less and less likely in a wider gamut of sports. There may be some sports, distance running would be one of them, where being big is no advantage whatsoever. Even the top elite male distance runners are absolutely tiny. They're like smaller than most women are, right? And maybe most of the advantages there, which are to do with the circulatory, the cardiovascular system, maybe they can be mitigated in those instances of very aerobic activities where being big is not advantageous. But in everything else, whether that's strength related, combat related, or cardiovascular activities where being big can be an advantage, such as rowing, then I think that it's pretty grim, quite honestly. And obviously anything that's height related, it's also going to be pretty grim. That is a shame, but we've got to look at the evidence. As the report states, it may be they're open to more evidence as new evidence comes out, but the evidence seems to be heading in the wrong direction at the moment. Principle 6, case-by-case assessment is unlikely to be practical nor verifiable for entry into gender-affected sports. So this case-by-case idea that we'll assess effectively trans women on a case-by-case method is something I think that World Rugby had suggested in some situations. It's also, I think, the principle that cricket has taken, which is that effectively we'll see whether any particular trans woman has, I don't know, too much of an advantage. It's also horribly woolly. Right from the outset, you can see that it's doomed not to work. These are the 4 bullet points that they have under this. I think they're quite interesting because it shows you some of the issues with this. The first one, it has not been scientifically validated as to whether any parameters of physical capacity or ability can be defined with a certain cut-off point at which someone is considered appropriately female or appropriately male. In other words, you start making awkward judgments here. And it's a lot harder for an official to make an awkward judgment than that, rather than having a set of actual hard line in the sand guidelines to go by. The second one, many tests related to sport performance are volitional. This means a person must try their very best to get an appropriate measurement. It is difficult to foresee how someone could be expected to provide maximal effort when a positive outcome for them relies on achieving a lesser result. So to give you an example of what that means, let's say we were trying, I transition to be a woman and I take testosterone, and they decide to measure my loss of strength to see whether it is sufficient by taking a grip using one of those hand dynamometers to measure my grip strength. So effectively what they're going to say is 12 months into it, after I've been taking these hormones, right, grip this dynamometer as tight as you can and let's see if you're still within your male equivalent range or if you've reduced sufficiently. That there is no incentive for me to grip that as tight as I can. If I grip it as tight as I can and show my full strength, I fail the test. If I don't grip it as tight as I can, I pass the test. Once you start incorporating tests where it is in the individual's interest to underperform, then you are stirring up a whole load of problems there. The third one, panel members are unlikely to be able to manage a situation in which their decisions can determine the suitability of some individuals and not others. In the absence of a scientific rationale, this places the panel members in a difficult situation. Let me read from you the consulting part of the report, a paragraph here. This sort of embellishes that a little bit. Those working within sport confessed that when faced with the need to make a case-by-case assessment in relation to transgender inclusion, they waved the individual through the process. They acknowledged there was a paucity of relevant data on which to base decisions, and so their first instinct was to be inclusive. They typically justified this approach by saying that they saw the individual concerned as presenting as their patient for whom they should advocate, or they were concerned about any possible legal challenge from an individual or group if they were excluded from participation. So you can imagine this situation. Look, if it's not clear, imagine the situation was this. We had the over 40s category, and what we said is, well, maybe 38 or 39-year-olds can compete in the over 40s category as long as they don't seem to have too much of an advantage over the 40-year-olds. And so a 38-year-old presents to me and I've got to try and make a case-by-case assessment on whether they have some advantage, and if so, what level of advantage it is, and whether I should knock them out and not somebody else. Imagine the arguments, imagine the discontent, imagine the grievances going in, imagine potentially the court cases going in because I allowed this 38-year-old into the over 40s and not this other 38-year-old. It's an absolute minefield. When you have a line in the sand and say, these are the rules and these are the rules for everybody and it's as simple as this, I'm sorry, you'll be 40 in a couple of days, then you can compete. At the moment you can't, right? It's much easier. You're giving the official the tools there and the confidence to say, yeah, we can apply this rule. Once you start leaving it to them, you place them in a very vulnerable and difficult position where it's very difficult to be consistent and where people are open to allegations and potentially legal action. Finally, it says case-by-case analysis may fall outside of the provisions of the Equality Act and may be based on criteria which cannot be lawfully justified. Some transgender people will be included, some will be excluded through criteria outside of their own control. So it's suggesting that the case-by-case assessment is dead in the water. It's a really poor way of doing things. You're just putting individuals in a very difficult position where what they end up doing is just getting scared of the whole thing and waving everybody through regardless of what reservations they may have. Principle 7. Categorisation by sex is lawful and hence the requirement to request information relating to birth sex is appropriate. So this is UK specific. This might not apply around the rest of the world, but in terms of the Equality Act 2010, which is the relevant legislation, what they are saying is that this is okay, that biological sex, birth sex, is something that you can discriminate on when you've got it, when it's a proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aim, as this would be. And that within our legislation within the UK, this is okay. Effectively, it is okay because sport has a dispensation that you don't have anywhere else. If you want to employ an accountant, you can't say, well, we're going to have two pools of accountants. Half of them are going to be male and half of them are going to be female. And to be a male accountant, you've got to be able to do 60 accounts a day. The female accountants have only got to do 45 accounts a day, right? That would never be allowed. That would be regarded as horribly unacceptable, right? It's got to be the same standard for everybody and the best person for the job. That isn't how sport works. Sport has a dispensation because we want to allow the ability for half the population to compete in sport at the elite level, whereas if we didn't have this dispensation, they would not be able to do so. And it is because of this dispensation and the wording of this dispensation that means that, yes, sport can get round this thing which they couldn't do anywhere else. If sport wasn't allowed to categorise by sex, then there would be no female category in the first place. There would just be one category that everybody took part in, and that category would be dominated by males. Okay, I'm going to miss out number 8 and I'm going to go on to number 9. Principle 9, the ability of NGBs and SGBs, that's not non-gender binaries, by the way, that's national governing bodies and sporting governing bodies, to provide the best mix of sporting options for the broader community may be determined by whether a model is intended as physical activity and participation or whether it represents meaningful competition. Okay, I'll mention a bit more about this when I show you the model that they're given in a minute, but this is them recognising a fact that sport fulfills a couple of functions. At the one hand, at the elite level, it's very, very much about winning. It's a professional thing. It's about the best versus the best. And maybe you need very, very tightly defined rules there. Further down the chain, things are very, very much woollier. We have different leagues. And if you're too good for one league, you'll sort of launch yourself or be forced to go into another league that better suits your skill level. And it's much more about participation. If you play in a village cricket team in a village cricket league, it's much about just playing some cricket and getting out there and having the games than it is about the win at all costs. It's not your career. It's not your profession. You're not getting paid to do this, or if you are, you're only getting paid a few pounds. It's not your main income. So this is the difference between these two things, and what they're saying is that maybe different models would apply even within the same sport. So within these set of principles, they're setting a set of principles that can be adopted differently within different sports depending upon the particulars of that sport, how the physical side features in that sport, the ethos of that sport, the ethos of the governing body, what the governing body is trying to achieve, but also within individual sports. They're setting it up and saying maybe it isn't one model for all levels of the sport, and you can have a layered approach. With that in mind, then, let's leave that behind. That's the principles. I'm not going to look at principle 10, principles 8 and 10 aren't really particularly interesting. Let's have a look at the model that they've given, and let's have I'll give you my thoughts with relation to that. Okay, so this is the model that they are advocating, and bear in mind this is not highly prescriptive. They're not saying this is the kind of outcome you must choose. They're saying these are your options, but bear in mind, sporting bodies, you need to be open and upfront about this and not suggest that the option that you're doing is going to satisfy things that it isn't satisfying. If you want to prioritise inclusion, using this sense of the word inclusion, then you're not prioritising fairness. Don't make out that you are. This is what they say with it briefly. They say these options are stated in no particular order, and for the avoidance of doubt are not stated in the order of importance. Each of transgender inclusion, fairness and safety are important, but the role each may play in individual sports will differ due to the nature of the sport. They also then say the choice of competitive format is not intended to be mutually exclusive, and national governing bodies and sporting governing bodies can opt to provide competition in more than one model. Okay, so I think those are really, really important points. What they're saying is we're not telling every sporting body what to do, but let's have a little bit of clarity here and have a bit of openness. And if what you want to say to the people who compete in your sport, effectively to the female athletes who compete in your sport, we've chosen to prioritise trans inclusion into your category over fairness, then you're going to have to step up to the plate and admit that is what you're doing, rather than trying to suggest that you're satisfying everybody's requirements at the same time. So look, prioritise transgender inclusion is one of the possibilities. And if you look at the statistics that they included there, when they surveyed people, I'll throw this graph up on the wall, 48% agreed and only 14% disagreed with the possibility that in sort of lower levels, which would be lower leagues and divisions, that inclusion, it might be sensible to prioritise inclusion. And I think that makes sense to me, by the way. I know some people see me as somebody who hammers on, who's solely wedded to the fairness side, but that's because my main interest is with elite sport, and that's my main concern, is elite sport. But I am minded that there are so many benefits for individuals for taking part in fitness and sporting activities. There are so many advantages for taking part in a team environment and a team sport, and that these are critical things. And trans people are one group that take part, statistically are underrepresented in sport, don't get involved in sport. And so this is a group that if we can encourage them to take part in sport, it will be to their health benefit, and that is something that we should do. And maybe lower level sport can be more accommodating. After all, if you have a league structure, what effectively happens is if you're too good for one league, you just end up in the next. Cycling, for example, has a categorisation structure. You start off, I think, in Cat 5. If you're too good for Cat 5, you go to Cat 4, then you go to Cat 3, to Cat 2, then Cat 1, and you're sort of heading towards the elite level there of professional cycling. So it may well be that if you transition, maybe if you were already a cyclist, you may have been a Cat 4 cyclist in men's cycling. If you then transfer into what would be the female cycling event, it may well be that you retain some residual advantages, but does that really matter if all that it means is you're competing in Cat 2 rather than Cat 4? What effectively you do, you will find your level the same as everybody else does, and then you will have enjoyable competition. This is entirely different from the idea of elite level, where you just kind of dominate the sport, and there isn't the idea of handicaps and divisions and leagues and all these kind of fudges that we do. These are all fudges that we do to trick ourselves into think that we're sort of competing in a way, and that we're proving something when we win the third division of the Cleckheaton Cricket League, right? But really what we're doing is we've already divided ourselves into a league of people who are of similar abilities, and so I don't see that that is as much of an issue. That is my view here. I'll then just jump across the middle one and talk about the create additional versions universal admission. I think this is kind of interesting, because one thing that they're suggesting is that sporting bodies should maybe question whether it's necessary, either at the lower levels or indeed at any level within their sport, to even segregate on the grounds of sex. It seems to be something we seem to do without even thinking, and obviously in a great number of sports, for physiological reasons, these are gender-affected sports and we need to have this sex binary. But there are other sports where it isn't entirely clear, and yet they seem to do it anyway. For example, in shooting, in archery, in darts, in snooker, these sports are sex segregated at present, and yet it isn't clear that they really need to be. It isn't clear that there are actually any physiological advantages that male athletes possess. Now, it may be that it turns out that men, as well as everything else, are also physiologically better at aiming than women are. But we don't know that to be the case. And it doesn't seem that that is the basis upon which we have these segregations. So it might be that in some of these sports, maybe the approach is to start thinking, well, maybe really we're having these segregations because we just feel that that's what we do in sport, and that in some of those sports you could abandon them entirely. And then we come to the middle one, and this is a really wonderful thing for me, because this is a model that I've been advocating for some time. I made a video back in March 2019 about this, effectively proposing and advocating for this very model of a female category, a protected female category, and then an open category that makes no mention whatsoever of either your sex or your gender. You could be male, you could be female, you could identify as a man, you could identify as a woman, you could identify as whatever non-gender binary gender identity you wish. It wouldn't make any difference because it is entirely non-specific. This is a category that is open to anybody to compete in, and it makes no comment on any of your characteristics that you are competing in this category. Indeed, any of the athletes who compete in the female category could also compete in the open category if they wished to. That is the nature of that category. It's a model that I've been advocating for some time. Didn't seem to be getting much traction. I know that John Pike of the Open University, a philosopher of sport, took part in the World Rugby consultation a while back, and he presented a proposal for exactly this kind of model. They rejected that, apparently, according to Ross Tucker of Science of Sport podcast, the sports scientist Ross Tucker. He thinks it's a pretty good idea as well, but he said that World Rugby just sort of waved it away out of hand. Hopefully this model is getting some more traction. This is what it says within this report. It says, national governing bodies and sporting governing bodies may choose to offer sport in which the female category is protected for reasons of competitive fairness and or safety if they are gender affected. These sports would offer both a female category and an open category. Female entries would be required to declare themselves as recorded female at birth. An open category would be available for any competitor to enter. Some sports may choose to acknowledge safety parameters as part of team selection in contact sports. All competitors will need to be compliant with anti-doping regulations, including in relation to prior or current use of anabolic agents, i.e. testosterone. The reason that's included, folks, is for the case of trans men who are on testosterone. If you're a trans man who is not on cross-sex hormone therapy, on testosterone, not taking exogenous testosterone, you would still be able to compete in the female category. But if you are taking it, then for doping reasons, effectively, you're taking exogenous testosterone, which would not be allowed in that category, but you would get a therapeutic use exemption in the open category because you're transitioning to be male, and it would be allowed within that category. Just to clarify that. This is something that I've been advocated for a long time. Even if you take away the whole business of pretend that trans people didn't exist. I know that will be misrepresented as me erasing trans people, but I'm just saying, even if they didn't exist, even people with differences of sexual development didn't exist. Just pretend the whole thing was a lot less messy, right? And we had a nice and simple binary, right, where everybody was female and identified as a woman, everybody was male and identified as a man. I would still advocate for this model because the sex binary categorisation is asymmetric. There is no reason whatsoever for not allowing females who wish to, who are aware of any risks, who are aware that they're going to be at a disadvantage, to compete in an open category if they wish to. In just the same way as we don't stop 45-year-olds competing in an age open category. We don't do that. It might be that none of them are any good enough in a particular sport, that they're too old, their performances decline too much, but if they want to give it a go, they are entitled to do so. But we do stop 30-year-olds competing in an over 40s category. It's an asymmetric categorisation. The protection goes one way and not the other. This is what the sex binary in sport is all about. It's an asymmetric boundary. I think the categories should reflect that, even aside from issues of trans people and issues of people with differences of sex development. Now, when you then bring those categories back, it becomes even more important, because then you get people, such as people who are non-gender binary, who don't identify as a man or a woman. And at present, we're forcing them to identify as one or the other for sport. You have people trans women who at present, regrettably, if you think they've got an unfair advantage, what you're saying to them is, you're going to have to go into category that's labelled man, even though you identify as a woman. Surely we can do better than that, right? So this is why I think this is a much better model. And it's exciting for me to think that going forwards, maybe this will actually start being implemented in some major sports. What I hope, in conclusion, this is just for the UK, but I hope that this has some impact wider, that maybe it helps the first signs, just as those first organisms in the sea developed a notochord, that the beginnings of a spine, the beginnings of a backbone, that it eventually developed into vertebrates, you know, with a proper fully formed spine, of which human beings are one such organism, maybe this will assist the International Olympic Committee in going through the same evolutionary process and developing the first signs of a spine of its own, and developing a sensible, workable policy that isn't just mush and hot air and numbers like the 10 nanomole figure that's just plucked out of their arses, to be quite frank. There's some hope with that this will help to embolden some of those other organisations to actually take grasp this nettle rather than just running scared and just hoping it all disappears. It isn't going to disappear. Okay, interested to know where this goes next. I'll leave that here. I will make another video. I'll release it at the same time. It's going to cover two topics. One topic will be an issue related to testosterone and the claim that testosterone makes no difference. So that isn't what is responsible for male performance. And the other issue is the idea of meaningfulness in sport versus fairness, and what meaningfulness really means, where meaningfulness functions into all of this and where fairness functions into all of this. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoy my material and you'd like to support it, I will leave you some options to do down below. That would be wonderful. If you enjoyed my material, don't want to support it, that's fine as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.